Welcome, everyone, to the B2B C-Suite Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got Ryan Hobson. Now, Ryan is going to be talking about the problem that we all have as CMOs is that we know we need to be very revenue focused. We know we interface with CEOs and CFOs and CROs that they're all very short term in terms of quotas and everything that we do. How is it contributing to revenue, especially in the short term? But we have to be balancing the long term and the short term. But we are scared, really, to be thinking about how do we spend in brand, right? Because it's hard, or we think it's hard, to measure the ROI. So Ryan's going to talk a lot about how we can measure impact, both long term, but specifically short term, because there's a direct correlation to brand spend. And you're going to talk about a media mix analysis and all kinds of different things. So I don't want to take away too much of your thunder. But if you could give us a bit of background, because I know you were at Adobe for over 10 years and you were running all their media mix and their attributions and tracking, and give us a little bit more on what you did there and what you're doing now.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Listened to a few of your podcasts and got really excited about the topics, and I hope this will be super applicable. But yeah, I was at Adobe for 10 years, helped during that time, B2B specifically, running marketing operations and analytics. During that 10 years, we went from a single source attribution model to a multi-touch attribution model. From there, we went to algorithmic attribution model, where we were assigning credit to channels based on how they lifted the likelihood of opportunities being created. Ultimately to a media mix model, which we'll get into today. They've been at B2C for a long time, but they're new to B2B, I think. So we'll get more into that, but did that for about 10 years. Toward the end of my time there, then I kind of realized, hey, I think there's a way to really build these media mix models specifically for B2B, because there's some, for sure, nuances and a really big nuance in the fact that there's a sales team in the process that makes B2B so different from B2C. So I thought there was a way to build these specifically for B2B. I saw how useful and helpful they were. And so joined Align BI a few years ago, where we built out a B2B specific media mix model, and have been doing that lately. And heard some of your podcasts and thought, hey, there's a way to measure this brand short term. And so wanted to come chat with you, and excited we are.
Well, fantastic. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was, I think there was a good illustration of this. It was this fear of spending in brand. Tell us, you posted a couple of things last week on LinkedIn, and you had a CMO posting on there that I think was just kind of a good illustration of the way that a lot of us feel. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, great, not great for her, but it was really like set up this conversation even. I commented about, wanting to discuss this year on LinkedIn, how to measure brand using media mix models and measure it next to all the performance marketing that people are doing. And her comment specifically was that she has been scared to spend in brand because she has a hard time measuring it. And we've seen all the long-term, we've seen the reports, there's the one from the Boston Consulting Group that talks about the long-term impact of brand. And as you set this up, we all know that as you spend in brand, it makes performance marketing easier. It improves overall ROI. But that takes time, and sometimes that's hard to sell to the CFO. Like, hey, I need 4 years of brand spend before I am held to any KPIs, right? Like, they're not going to do that. You do need to be able to measure, and that was her fear, was like, how do I spend in brand? I have a hard time spending there without being able to measure even the short-term impact of it. That's where I think these media mix models do a great job, that we'll get into how they work, but that's exactly what we're talking about today.
Could you give us just a definition of what a media mix model is?
Yeah, let's jump into it a little bit. So in B2B, we've been measuring leads into a CRM. And then how do those leads that went into the CRM, how do they become an opportunity? And there's so much logic just in that simple statement. There are multiple leads at an account. And so, we've been through this. We've moved to account-based marketing to try to make up for that. But there's a lot of touches that are trying to be measured in that process. Hundreds of touches, lots of times. And our attribution models are woefully under accurate that if you're picking one of 100 activities, there's no way that's very accurate. If you're spreading credit across 100 activities to assign your credit, well, now you've got 1/100th of a credit. I've done all of them. And what happens is at the end of that, I mentioned I did single source, I've done multi-touch, I've done algorithmic. All that changed was how much credit something was getting. So like search would maybe go from 25% to 30% to most sophisticated. Now we're at 35% credit. But what I'm left to figure out still is 35% credit good or bad? As a CMO, is that good or bad? Should I be doing more or less search is really the question, and how much more or less search. And our attribution models don't do that. They just are a descriptive statistic, and probably a fairly inaccurate descriptive statistic. What we want to know is, what should I do more or less of? So what a media mix model does is, instead of it being a path-based credit assignment, it's basically a big regression model. And what's great about that is you no longer are reliant on only forms. Because right now, to capture the touch in an attribution model, you need a form. The form brings through the lead, brings through that touch, saves it on the record. So a lot of the stuff we do, podcasts, brand, PR, a lot of the dark social that don't lead to forms are important activities, but because they don't lead to a form, we aren't able to measure those in traditional attribution. So a media mix model is saying, hey, as you've increased your podcasts, as you have increased your brand spend, as you've increased search, what is the statistical relationship to, and you can do multiple stages, to your, you can do qualified leads, to your opportunities, to your closed one. And so it's saying, hey, as I've done more of this, what is that statistical relationship to these success events in my funnel that I care about? And so it does a few things for you. At that point, you're measuring things that you haven't been able to measure before that required forms. And then once the statistical model is built, where the real power is, now you can optimize that model to find the optimal mix that maximizes that dependent variable that you care about. So let me give an example of how that mattered to me at Adobe. My CMO at Adobe never cared about my attribution models. Very rarely did she ever care how much credit search was getting. She just wanted to know, are we going to do more or less search? As we stood up this media mix model, suddenly me, my CMO, and my VP, the three of us are in a room, and we have this model built, and now we can run budget scenarios across the model, and it's telling us the optimal mix across brand, these other channels that she didn't have in there. And now she's interested because I've got her whole budget, and we're talking, what are we doing more or less of and how much? That became this powerful example to me of like, now I'm speaking the right language. I'm speaking the language my CMO cares about, where the descriptive statistics are important. I can step through that media mix model a little slower if you want to dive into the science a little bit more, but at a high level, that's how they're different. Think of it as regression modeling, looking at trends and how they relate, instead of backward-looking credit assignment.
Well, you just finished up with what I was going to say. My takeaway there was, we're able to measure things that we haven't been able to measure before, but we're able to take what's happened in the past and predict what can happen in the future. That's big, right? So that's one of my big takeaways there. The other thing is that as CMOs, we're all supposed to be data driven. So we all say we are, right? And we all say that we have the ability to look at attribution tracking. And I've had CMOs on the show, and they're very proud. They're like, hey, we've got, we can show when there's 5 marketing touches or more, we double the opportunity to close that business, right? So we want to get very, very data focused. We want to be predictive, and we want to show impact, right? And that's how we go to our CFOs and we say, here's the budget that we need, and here's how we're going to spend it. And here's what we anticipate that we're going to get from it. So what you're saying is that is possible.
Yeah. So in the media mix model process, that optimization, it tells you the optimal mix, but then it tells you what will come from that optimal mix. So I fed in all of my historical spends. Typically, we're grabbing like 2 years of spend data across your marketing channels, 2 years of funnel data. And then we'll say, okay, the model will spit out, this is the optimal mix, increase display, decrease events, right? Like it'll tell you and how much, and then it will say, based on this optimal mix, your ROI will increase by X, pipeline will increase by Y. So it will give you a forecast from that optimal mix. And then there's some art at the end of it. So you may say, hey, the model's telling me to do more events, and I just don't have the capacity to do more events. So you can constrain these media mix models. You can say, hey, don't push any more money to events. I can't do more events. Now run the optimization, and it'll push it to your next highest ROI kind of curve channels. So it's using those ROI curves and diminishing returns and lags to figure out that. But you're right, it ends up producing a forecast from your budget.
Tell us how it relates to content. And let me frame that question a little bit differently, because Forrester put it, content is the foundation for all marketing. And everything that we do in demand generation, performance marketing, it's promoting the content that we create, because our goal is not to sell, sell, sell. Our goal, and our buyers don't want to be sold to, they want to be educated, they want to be advised. So we try to spend a lot of time creating content that is in that education, that advisory category. You could call it thought leadership, but you could call it branding, however you want to, label it. Right? But we spend a lot of time as B2B marketers, especially in an ABM process, creating content that is worthy of our B2B buyers who are consuming more and more content. They've got this trend towards self-serve buying. So the content, the goal is, how do we get a conversation going earlier in that buyer's journey? Because in order to do that, we've got to grab their attention. So we can't be talking about features and benefits, and there's a time and a place for that. But the emphasis is more on creating higher quality content to get earlier in that buyer journey. How does all of this fit together? How does that major effort that we're putting in to create that thought leadership brand level content, how is this helping support those efforts?
Yeah. And even how do you measure those, right? So
Right.
I think what's really cool is if we classify content, like you said, in branding content. So spend in brand that's not gated, podcasts that aren't gated, YouTube's not gated, dark social, PR, a lot of this content we're creating that's ungated, but really important to getting our name out and building our brand. You don't have to just wait for the long-term measurement. So there's all these brand measurement that we talked about earlier on, right? But it's hard for a CMO to say, hey, our brand score, let me spend for the next 4 years and we'll see our brand score increase a little bit. And the CFO is going to say, great, but we need pipeline today, right? So what a media mix model will enable from a content perspective is the ability to statistically measure, as we've increased brand spend, as we've increased podcast efforts, as we've increased social efforts, and this higher level content, we can find a statistical relationship between that and short-term pipeline. So there's kind of two ways that a media mix model will help us measure that brand content. First, we'll say short-term. We can see, hey, after the model's built, and I looked at some of our customer data, we're seeing between 5 to 15% of short-term pipeline being explained by the brand channels. So a CMO could say, hey, I'm going to invest in brand, and hey, CFO, don't stress, 5 to 15% of the pipeline that we're going to see, in the coming quarters will be driven by this brand efforts. So they can put a number to it. The other number you can put to it, and it's a little bit trickier, but it does explain the importance of this brand content, is it comes from that Boston Consulting Group article I even saw. We talked about it. They talk about how companies who spend in brand see a 25 to 40% increase in ROI when that brand spend is strong and when they're a known brand. You can think of it this way. If I'm calling to sell something as Adobe, it's a lot easier for me to get in the door because people know Adobe. We've got this basically this baseline. So what a media mix model will create is a baseline that shows, hey, a certain percent of your pipe creation is not being explained by any of this performance marketing. And you can call that baseline like, hey, if we shut everything off we would still see a baseline of sales. And a lot of that is based on your brand strength, right? Your sales team calling in with a strong brand makes that sale a lot easier. So there is that baseline that can be measured. But with the media mix model, we can bring in that content creation, all the effort on the high level brand and everything else they're doing, and correlate it to a short-term pipeline and see how much of the short-term pipeline is also explained. And then the CMO can say, hey, don't worry, we're going to see short-term impact from that. That's the way I would think about it from a brand content. If you think of it like from an offer perspective, we're not really bringing offers into these media mix models. We're keeping them at the channel level, because then you're into thousands of offers and that gets hard to optimize across. But if you're talking about content creation at that brand channel, podcast channel level, then those are absolutely brought in and looked for in that media mix model process, that relationship to short-term and long-term.
Absolutely. And this 5 to 15%, right, contribution. That Boston Consulting Group article you're talking about with the up to 40% ROI coming out of that spend. So I'm going to layer in a couple additional factors that as CMOs, we should be thinking about in terms of what other ways am I benefiting from this in the short term? Because I think if we get the total conversation going here, it's no longer like that CMO who was posting on your LinkedIn about how I'm kind of scared because I can't see the ROI from this. So there was another CMO, 3-time B2B CMO, very smart. Her name's Jamie Geyer, and she's the CMO of a healthcare SaaS company called Dexcare. And she put it this way. She said, Steve, today's brand is tomorrow's demand. And that's putting in very simple terms what you're saying, right? Is that it's actually driving pipeline. But she said, there's 2 ways that you benefit from this. And she said, in an ABM sales process where the salesperson has to be perceived as a trusted advisor, you can't just be a salesperson, right? So you're constantly doing things that are building up that stature, that expertise of the company, that expertise of the actual sales rep themselves as a trusted advisor. And she said, if we do our brand and we spend correctly, we are taking literally cycles away from the sales process, because that ABM-based salesperson doesn't have to spend as much time proving that they're worthy of being a trusted advisor. They come in as a trusted advisor. So that is massive short-term impact, right there. Here's the second way. Second way is that in any ABM sales process, you can't just sell, right? You've got to add value. And there's not a salesperson alive in an ABM process that isn't looking for ways to add value, stay in touch, keep in front of the buyer, right? And if you're creating that brand level, high quality content that positions the company as experts, right? That thought leadership type content, then those are the things that can be activated and shared on a daily basis. In fact, that's part of the SLAs between marketing and sales, right? We created this incredible content, and now part of our service level agreement is let's share it. Each of you share it out with 30 people this week, right? Yep. So there is day-to-day sharing, and that is accelerating the ABM process. There is absolutely taking away cycles from the ABM sales process. This all leads to greater quota attainment. This is all short term. So I think the total outcome here from the conversation is we can't afford not to be. If you're not spending on brand, what you are is you're spending on product marketing. And you're talking about feature benefit, you're talking about things that are important after you're further down the decision-making process. But we know 95% of our audience is not in the market to buy right now. So we have to be spending on brand. We can't afford not to spend on brand.
That's right.
So when you were at Adobe and you're sitting down with your CMO and your VP marketing, and you're talking and you're predicting brand spend, and how did that all come into play, right? How did the total thinking about focus on brand spending and ROI, what was the thinking behind that?
That's a really good question. And that actually got a little bit to the art of it. So we would build the models, and the models would say we had brand as a separate spend. And so we had brand right next to search and display, kind of the performance events all right next to it. And as I've worked with other companies, sometimes brands intermingled in there. Like there could be brand spend inside of search and performance marketing inside of search. So I have seen people split that out within a channel where others just bucket brand as one channel. So you can do it a few ways. But what would happen is we would get to the optimization. And it is true that those performance channels tend to have a stronger relationship with short-term pipeline. So the model would often say, hey, decrease for the short term if our main variable that we wanted to optimize was pipe creation. The model sometimes would say, hey, decrease brand, increase these other channels. And so that's where we would start to discuss, hey, we want to stay and continue to invest in brand. We know that there is a short-term impact, even though it maybe not as strong short-term, it is definitely creating that baseline long-term. So what we would do is we constrain it sometimes. We'd say, hey, let's not take from brand because we know that there will be long-term, but it still will have an impact on short-term. So let's constrain it. Now run the optimization. Now where should it go? Everything goes. And so then your brand is still in the mix. Its impact on short-term pipe creation is there and being measured and is part of the forecast. So you can even scenario plan. Let's say that you're as a CMO, you've got some short-term pipeline that your CFO is like really wants you to hit. You can do these what if scenario efforts with it, which is what's really cool. You can say, okay, in this scenario, let's drop brand and we'll let everything else get spent. And let's see what happens short term. Now, let's see if we increase our brand spend a little bit in the short term. Can I still meet my short term goals with how the rest of the money's being spent? You can inch up and you can say, hey, I think I can continue to spend up to this amount in brand and hit this short-term target that my CFO has for next quarter. And so you can play with them, which is where, again, the strength of these media mix models, what if scenario planning. In a traditional attribution model, it's really hard to say, well, if I got 36% credit instead of 26% credit, what does that do to my forecast in some search? But in this, it's like, okay, can decrease this, increase this, run the forecast. Okay, this is what it looks like we'll hit. And then as a CMO, you can make that trade-off. Like, okay, I think I want to spend more right now at the expense of maybe hitting my short-term target. You talk with your CFO, or maybe you find that amount where I can spend up to this amount in brand without missing the target that I want to hit next quarter. And it becomes this like collaborative scenario planning environment, not only with your CMO, if you're the one running the tool, but then with the CFO and other sales and your other stakeholders as you do these scenario plans.
Well, that's what I'm thinking about here because you've seen the podcast and we have done a series, and I think we're on part 7 now of why B2B CMOs fail so quickly. And a huge part of that is measuring the impact, attributing to the efforts that are being put into place, and there can be a lag time on that. But it's also a huge part of it is the relationship, the alignment with CROs and CFOs or head of sales, right? And what you're talking about here is bringing it in more into a science, right? Instead of saying, trust me, right? And CFOs can be looking and CEOs can be looking at CMOs and saying, you're the creative types, you're very optimistic but we have to live in the real world, right? And we don't want that perception as a CMO. Right. We want the perception to be, yes, we're highly creative, we're highly strategic, and we're forecasters.
We're a
right?
revenue center. Yeah, not a cost center. We're a revenue center. And this is what you're going to get revenue from this mix that I'm suggesting to you next quarter that includes some brand spend.
Tell us a little bit about just with your clients or at Adobe, how that happens, the partnerships that then get created between CMOs and other executives, right? Where instead of being in silos, it's like it's a team.
Yeah,
right?
We did this. It was a really good example just recently with the company, working with their VP of demand and growth. And he has a finance partner. And the finance partner helped us collect all of the historical spend. and he could understood what we were trying to build, but also didn't fully grasp what was about to come. So he helps us collect it all. We bring it in, we build the model strong, do the optimization. We show him, okay, here is the optimal mix that we would forecast. And we do this in front of his finance partner. And it's this light bulb went on for him. And he's suddenly, like, almost instantly, within the hour, he became this advocate of, okay, great, I'm partnered with you. We're going to give you this money. You're now telling me what's coming from it. You're including all of the budget, not just the demand gen stuff. You're including everything in there. This is what you're saying is going to come from it. I can go back to CFO and say, okay, we're giving them, this is where they're spending it. This is what they're forecasting to come from it. If they do more of this or less of that, this is what happens. And he immediately, like this VP of demand, immediately now had this advocate of, hey, we can give it money and this is what's going to come from it. And we can feel pretty confident about it. And so it became, like this financial controller became as much a part of our optimization meetings and model as much as marketing was. It was fun to see that come on. And like I say, that's when the light bulb came on for me at Adobe, is suddenly CMO, I'm talking her entire budget instead of this demand portion. And so now that's collaborative. It really does, I think. And you brought up CRO, which I failed to mention, but it's perfect for CROs who are trying to optimize how much do I spend in sales versus marketing, and what will the difference be as I spend there. So it allows for that scenario planning across teams.
It's because as CMOs, we are constantly advocating for our budgets, right? We have to keep selling. Just this year, I can't tell you how many CMOs that I've talked to that say, yeah, I'm being told, here's what's happening to your budget.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, hey, if you give me this, look what I can do for you.
And here's where it's hard for me. I've done this for 10 years. It's almost therapy, like, to talk about this stuff. What's so amazing about that scenario where if you were like, hey, we're cutting your budget 30% next year. On these media mix models, you can toggle your budget down 30% and show them, this is how the forecast changes when you cut my budget 30%. And so now you're letting them say, okay, this is how it changes. If you're comfortable with it, this is, what I can support in pipe creation on this lower budget. And then you can toggle back up. But look, if you hold it flat, this is what we can forecast. This is where we'll spend it. And you can do that without going back to a spreadsheet and spending a day trying to update all your inputs. These models are ran across multiple scenarios. And so all it becomes in the dashboard is a toggle where you're just toggling down 30%. This is the new optimization. This is the new forecast. And so it becomes really fast to just highlight what's happening as that budget shifts.
So in a weird way of thinking about this, it's like, okay, you're going to reduce my budget by 30%. Here's the negative impact, right? So, just expect. And that way, there's a real world ramification. Instead of saying there's this generic cost center, which is one of the biggest in the company, called marketing. We don't really know what we're getting out of it. There's a lot of just faith and we got to be doing this. In that world, it's easy to cut.
Yeah.
But when there is a real world, okay, here's the direct impact that's going to create on pipeline. Now you're going to think twice about that.
Right.
And if we're not equipped with that as CMOs, then we're at basically the whim of our CFOs, our CEOs, our CROs, because everybody, guess what? Everybody's going to the CEO and then the CFO and saying, I need more money. Mm-hmm. Right. So we're fighting for competing allocations of resources. And if we don't have a good way to then say, okay, well, here's what I can do for you. And on the reverse side, here's the impact if we do take it down. If we don't have those arguments, those arrows in our quiver, we're just one voice saying we shouldn't, right? It's a qualitative kind of conversation. So I have one more really important question for you. If there was one takeaway as a CMO listening to this, or anybody that's head of marketing, running marketing in their B2B organization, there's one takeaway, what would that takeaway be?
My takeaway, and what I'm trying to evangelize to everybody, is when I moved at Adobe from it was a very sophisticated attribution model, but it was still descriptive statistic. When I moved from there to a media mix model, I finally found what I had been looking for 10 years. And it was, what should I do more or less of? What I'm hoping to communicate to CMOs and everybody is rules-based attribution. We thought for years that was like the holy grail. And if we got that right, then suddenly insights become easier. And having done that for 10 years, you'll get to the end of that attribution process and you'll find you still just have a descriptive statistic that you're trying to figure out what to do more or less from. So these media mix models are incredible. They're not widely used, but they're becoming more popular in B2B. I think the sales team is what made it tricky. But as we build these specifically for B2B, we can bring in sales data to be part of this model. But it allows you to measure brand, short and long term. It allows you to measure PR. You don't have to gate everything to do it. So I think what I'm hoping to communicate is like this breath of fresh air that like we're not restricted to forms. We don't only measure demand and hope for brand. Like we can bring them together, we can optimize it and have it forecast what will happen, which is what we're looking for that attribution models just haven't delivered. So I explore them, look into them. You can do it. It's not too hard. The data just gets organized on this daily, weekly level, and then it's ran through these regression models. You can build them on your own. There's some nuances and they need some data science experience. We're happy to help, but trust, like, it's just such a better way, so much easier, so much more insightful. Like, I think hopeful, right? I know it's so stressful to be a CMO, so there's a way to do it, and you should definitely look into these media mix models.
So if somebody did have questions, they wanted to reach out for help, they wanted to talk to you, would giving them a link to your profile on LinkedIn, would that be the best way?
Yeah. LinkedIn, reach out. I'll even just do a training just to teach on how they work. You can decide if you have a data science team that can build it or not. We have one that we can do. I just think this is where B2B is starting to go. And so happy to just educate if that's all you're looking for. Happy to have conversations around how to do these.
Fantastic. Well, Ryan, thank you very much for coming and sharing all the insights and giving us hope.
Yeah. Grateful for the opportunity, and your podcast has been great listening to. So keep helping those CMOs out there.